1867, in a remote farming community outside Sedalia, Missouri, the most disturbing medical case study ever documented in the American Midwest would center on 8-year-old Timothy Caldwell. 3 leather-bound journals were filled with observations by the region's only physician, Dr. Samuel Harding, detailing a child whose behavior defied every principle of human nature known to 19th-century medicine. To casual observers, the boy appeared normal, even charming. But medical science of the era simply could not explain what lay beneath his innocent exterior. Over 6 months, 3 people died in accidents around Timothy Caldwell, along with dozens of farm animals found dead under mysterious circumstances. These were 11 people who had all in some way crossed paths with a child whose smile never reached his pale blue eyes. Local authorities sealed the official records and hid them away for over a century. But the truth about Timothy Caldwell reveals a darkness that challenges everything we thought we knew about the capacity for evil in childhood. Before we continue with the story of Timothy Caldwell and the terror that gripped Sedalia County, if this story intrigues you, make sure to subscribe to our channel and ring that notification bell so you never miss our deep dives into America's darkest historical mysteries. We love hearing from our community of mystery enthusiasts around the world, so please let us know in the comments what state or city you're listening from. The events that would make Timothy Caldwell infamous began not with violence, but with loss. The Missouri of 1867 was a state still bleeding from the wounds of civil war. Their young men had been sent to die on distant battlefields by towns like Sedalia, leaving behind widows, orphans, and communities struggling to rebuild. Nestled in a valley 15 miles south of town, the Caldwell farm had once been prosperous. James and Martha Caldwell had built their homestead with dreams of raising cattle and corn, but those dreams died with James at the Battle of Wilson's Creek in 1861. Alone, Martha tried to maintain the farm, but consumption took her lungs in the bitter winter of 1865. Their son, Thomas, barely 21, inherited land he couldn't work and debts he couldn't pay. When word arrived that his brother William had died at Andersonville Prison, leaving behind a widow and 8-year-old son, Thomas saw both burden and opportunity. The boy Timothy would need a home, and Thomas needed help with the endless work of farming. A hard man, made harder by war and loss, was Thomas Caldwell. During their childless years, his wife Sarah had grown sharp-tongued and bitter. Neither was particularly suited for raising a child, especially one who arrived at their door in the spring of 1866, carrying nothing but a small cloth bag and eyes that seemed far too old for his young face. Small for his age was Timothy Caldwell, with pale skin that burned easily in the Missouri sun, and blonde hair that his Aunt Sarah kept cut short to keep the lice away. He spoke little of his life before the farm, offering only fragments when pressed. His father had been a soldier. His mother had coughed blood. After she died, he had lived with neighbors for a while. What struck adults most about Timothy was his politeness. "Yes, sir, and yes, ma'am," he always said. He never complained about work or punishment. He seemed in every way to be the model of a well-behaved child. When the boy accompanied his uncle to town for supplies in June of 1866, Dr. Samuel Harding first encountered Timothy. A graduate of the Missouri Medical College and one of the few formerly trained physicians west of St. Louis, Harding had developed a keen eye for reading people during his years treating both Union and Confederate soldiers. Something about the Caldwell boy unsettled him, though he couldn't identify what. The child was perfectly respectful, Harding would later write in his journal. He answered questions directly, maintained appropriate eye contact, and displayed none of the fidgeting or shyness typical of rural children encountering strangers. Yet, I found myself deeply uncomfortable in his presence. An intensity seemed to be held in his gaze, as if he was studying me with the same clinical interest that I typically reserved for my patients. The farming community around Sedalia was small enough that everyone knew everyone else's business. Isolated, but not so isolated that neighbors didn't notice things, was the Caldwell farm. Mrs. Ella Patterson, whose property bordered the Caldwell land, would often see Timothy working in the fields or tending to the livestock. She remarked to her husband that the boy worked with unusual focus for a child his age, never seeming to tire, never stopping to play or rest, as children naturally do. It was like watching a little machine, she told her husband Samuel over dinner one evening. From sunrise to sunset, he'd worked steady, never complaining, never slowing down. Ain't natural for a boy to have no play in him at all. Ella noticed that her birds became agitated whenever Timothy was near the property line on the Patterson farm, which kept chickens. They would cluster together, squawking and ruffling their feathers, refusing to venture close to the fence that separated the properties. Her husband dismissed it as coincidence, but Evelina couldn't shake the feeling that the animals sensed something about the boy that humans missed. On a sweltering afternoon in August 1866, the first death occurred. Known throughout the community for her bright laugh and tendency to wander was little Mary Fletcher, age 5, the daughter of the town blacksmith. She had been playing near Willow Creek, a shallow stream that ran between several properties, including the Caldwell farm. Timothy found her body. Just as the family was preparing for supper, he arrived at the Fletcher home, his clothes damp and his face pale with what appeared to be genuine distress. "Mrs. Fletcher," he said, his voice steady despite his obvious agitation. "I found Mary by the creek. She's not breathing." Face down in water barely 18 in deep was where the search party that rushed to the creek found Mary Fletcher. Dr. Harding, summoned immediately, determined that the child had drowned, a tragic but not uncommon accident in rural areas where children played unsupervised near water. What troubled Harding was not the death itself, but Timothy's account of discovering the body. An unusually detailed description of exactly where Mary had been found, the position of her body, and the condition of her clothing was provided by the boy. When pressed about how he had come to be in that particular spot at that particular time, Timothy explained that he had been looking for a lost calf. The boy's recall was remarkably precise, Harding noted in his journal. He could describe the exact position of the deceased child's limbs, the way her dress had been caught on a submerged branch, even the color of the water around her face. Such attention to detail seemed unusual for a child who claimed to be frightened and upset by the discovery. When questioned, Thomas Caldwell confirmed that one of their calves had indeed gone missing that morning, and that he had sent Timothy to search the creek area. 2 days later, the calf was found, healthy and grazing in a meadow nearly a mile from where Mary Fletcher had drowned. Devastated by their loss, the Fletcher family received Timothy's sympathy with gratitude. He had, after all, been the one to find their daughter and alert them immediately. With his aunt and uncle, Timothy sat quietly at the funeral. His head bowed respectfully throughout the service. With appropriate solemnity, he accepted their gratitude when the family thanked him for his quick action in alerting them. "I wish I could have found her sooner," he told Mary's father, his voice carrying just the right note of regret and sorrow. But Evelina Patterson, watching from across the church, noticed something that nagged at her for days afterward. When Mary Fletcher's mother collapsed in grief during the service, when the sight of the small coffin reduced grown men to tears, Timothy Caldwell's expression never changed. His head was bowed in apparent sorrow, but when he thought no one was looking, his pale blue eyes remained dry and watchful, taking in every detail of the scene around him. 3 weeks later, the second death came. A Norwegian immigrant who had worked as a logger before arthritis forced him into retirement, old Henrik Len, was found at the bottom of a rocky outcrop known locally as Devil's Bluff. The bluff overlooked the creek where Mary Fletcher had drowned, and Henrik was known to climb there regularly to check on the wild beehives he tended. Once again, Timothy Caldwell was involved in the discovery. He had been walking home from town when he spotted something unusual at the base of the bluff. "I saw Mr. Lson's hat caught on a thorn bush," Timothy told the gathering crowd. "I called out to him, but got no answer, so I climbed down to look." His neck broken from what appeared to be a fall from the top of the 40-foot bluff, Henrik Larsson was dead. Dr. Harding's examination revealed that the old man had likely died instantly upon impact. The presence of several dead bees scattered around the body, far more than would typically be found away from a hive, was the only unusual aspect of the scene. "Mr. Larsson knew those bluffs better than any man in the county," Samuel Patterson told Dr. Harding after the examination. "For 3 years, he'd been climbing up there. Never had so much as a stumble. Don't make sense he'd fall now." When questioned, Timothy suggested that perhaps the old man had been stung by bees and lost his footing. "He was always talking about how angry they get when you disturb them," the boy said. "Maybe they swarmed him and he got confused." Plausible was Timothy's explanation to Dr. Harding, but something about the scene bothered him. Directly around Henrik's body, the dead bees were all clustered in a small area. If the old man had disturbed a hive at the top of the bluff, there should have been more evidence of bee activity along his presumed path of flight and fall. Instead, it appeared as though the bees had somehow been concentrated around the impact site. When Harding climbed to the top of the bluff to examine the beehives, he found them intact and showing no signs of recent disturbance. Active but not agitated, the worker bees were going about their normal business of gathering nectar from the late summer wildflowers. Any illusions about coincidence were shattered by the third death. In September 1866, 6-year-old Jacob Mills vanished while playing in the woods near his family's cabin. 4 days later, his body was found in an abandoned well nearly half a mile from where he had last been seen. Timothy Caldwell had volunteered to join the search party. For 3 days, Timothy searched alongside the adult volunteers, showing remarkable endurance for a child his age. Intimately, he seemed to know the woods, guiding searchers through areas that even long-time residents found difficult to navigate. When asked how he had learned the terrain so well, Timothy explained that he often explored the woods during his free time, looking for useful plants and herbs that his aunt could use for cooking and medicine. Just after dawn on the 4th day, Timothy appeared at the Mills cabin. "I think I found something," he told Jacob's father, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "There's an old well about a half-mile north of here." I heard what sounded like crying. Partially concealed by fallen logs and overgrown brush was the well. At the bottom was Jacob Mills, alive but barely conscious, suffering from dehydration and exposure. Dr. Harding was summoned immediately, but the boy died within hours of being pulled from the well, his small body unable to recover from the ordeal. The child had been at the bottom of that well for nearly 4 days, Harding wrote in his journal. The fact that Timothy Caldwell was able to locate him in such an obscure location raises troubling questions. How extensive is the boy's knowledge of the local terrain? What other hidden dangers might he be aware of? More troubling still was Timothy's behavior during Jacob's final hours. While the Mills family maintained a vigil around their dying son, Timothy sat quietly in the corner of the cabin, apparently praying. But Dr. Harding, positioned where he could observe the boy without being noticed, saw something that deeply disturbed him. Praying, Timothy wasn't. His lips were moving, but his eyes were fixed on Jacob Mills with an intensity that seemed almost scientific. Every detail of the dying child's condition, he appeared to be cataloging. The labored breathing, the pale skin, the way consciousness flickered in and out. When Jacob finally died, Timothy's expression showed no grief or shock. Instead, there was something that Harding could only describe as satisfaction. After the funeral, Dr. Harding made an excuse to visit the abandoned well where Jacob had been found. For reasons he couldn't articulate, the sight troubled him. Indeed, well hidden was the well, concealed by natural debris that would have taken considerable effort to move. Yet Timothy had claimed to hear crying from this location, a claim that seemed improbable given the depth of the well and the amount of brush covering it. As Harding examined the scene more carefully, he noticed something that the initial rescue party had missed in their urgency to save Jacob Mills. Around the rim of the well, the debris had been arranged with unusual precision. Logs and branches that should have fallen randomly showed signs of deliberate placement, creating a natural-looking camouflage that would be nearly impossible to spot unless one knew exactly where to look. Too disturbing to voice aloud were the implications, but Harding could not shake the suspicion that Jacob Mills had not simply fallen into the well. Someone had placed him there, and someone had carefully concealed the location until the boy was too weak to survive rescue. That evening, Harding began keeping detailed notes about Timothy Caldwell. If his suspicions were correct, the boy posed a danger to the entire community. But suspicions were not evidence, and evidence was exactly what Harding lacked. By all appearances, a model child was the problem that Timothy Caldwell was. Regularly with his aunt and uncle, he attended church, sitting quietly through services and reciting prayers with appropriate reverence. Diligently on the farm, he worked, completing tasks that would challenge many adult workers. Respectfully to his elders, he spoke and showed proper deference to authority figures. Most importantly, Timothy had plausible explanations for his presence at each tragedy. He had been looking for a lost calf when he found Mary Fletcher. He had been walking home from town when he spotted Henrik Len's hat. He had volunteered to help search for Jacob Mills, as any concerned member of the community would do. But Harding's medical training had taught him to look beyond surface appearances. In treating wounded soldiers, he had learned to recognize the signs of men who killed not from patriotic duty or desperate necessity, but from something darker and more fundamental. A coldness existed in such men, a disconnection from normal human emotion that manifested in subtle ways, too little reaction to horror, too much interest in suffering, an ability to discuss violence with clinical detachment. All of these characteristics were displayed by Timothy Caldwell, but compressed into the body and face of an 8-year-old child. In October 1866, Dr. Harding's investigation began in earnest. Using his position as the community's physician, he made regular visits to farms and homes throughout the area, ostensibly checking on the health of families still recovering from the hardships of war. In reality, he was gathering information about Timothy Caldwell. A disturbing picture of a child who seemed to exist at the center of an ever-widening circle of misfortune was what he discovered painted. At unusual rates, livestock on neighboring farms had been dying, not from disease, but from what appeared to be accidental injuries. Found with broken necks were chickens, apparently killed by foxes that left no other signs of predation. Mysterious wounds were suffered by pigs that became infected and led to death. Sudden lameness was developed by horses that forced farmers to put them down. To Dr. Harding, Mrs. Elenina Patterson confided that she had lost 17 chickens in the past 2 months. "It's the strangest thing," she said. "They're dying 1 or 2 at a time, always found in the morning with their necks broken clean. My husband thinks it's foxes, but I've never seen fox sign around the coop. And the way they're killed, it's too neat, too." When Harding examined the most recent casualties, he found evidence that supported Eleanor's suspicions. With precise force applied to specific points on their necks, the chickens had been killed, a technique that required considerable knowledge of anatomy. It was not the random violence typical of predator attacks, but something much more deliberate and controlled. On other farms, similar patterns emerged. 3 calves had been lost by James Wickham to what he described as freak accidents. Animals that had somehow managed to strangle themselves on ropes or wedge their heads in fence rails in ways that defied logical explanation. Robert Dunham's prize bull had fallen into a ditch and broken its leg despite being one of the most sure-footed animals in the county. In every case, the affected farms were within walking distance of the Caldwell property, and in several instances, neighbors reported seeing Timothy in the vicinity around the time of the incident. "I saw him walking along our fence line the morning before we found the calf," James Wickham told Dr. Harding. "Thought it was odd, him being so far from home, but the boy was always polite when he saw me, waved, and called out a greeting like he was taught proper." During his routine medical visits to the Caldwell farm, Dr. Harding also began paying closer attention to Timothy's behavior. The boy was always present during these visits, standing quietly while Dr. Harding examined his aunt and uncle for the various ailments common to farming life. But Harding noticed that Timothy watched these examinations with unusual interest, asking questions about anatomy and medical procedures that seemed advanced for a child his age. "How do you know if someone's really dead?" Timothy asked during one visit, his tone casual as if discussing the weather. "Sometimes people just look like they're sleeping." When pressed to explain his curiosity, Timothy said he was concerned about being able to help if someone was hurt while he was alone on the farm. "Uncle Thomas says I need to know how to handle emergencies since we're so far from town," he explained. Reasonable was the explanation, but something about the question disturbed Dr. Harding. A clinical quality to Timothy's interest in death and injury that went beyond normal childhood curiosity was there. The boy asked about the mechanics of dying, how long it took, what signs to look for, whether people could survive various types of trauma with the same detached interest that a medical student might show when studying cadavers. During these conversations, Harding began testing Timothy's knowledge with deliberately false information, claiming that certain injuries were fatal when they were not, or that specific symptoms indicated particular conditions. Directly, Timothy never challenged these false statements. But Harding noticed that the boy filed away every piece of information with remarkable retention. More disturbing still was Timothy's response to Dr. Harding's stories about treating wounded soldiers during the war. While most children showed appropriate shock or sadness when hearing about battlefield injuries, Timothy listened with rapt attention, asking detailed questions about wound patterns, blood loss, and survival rates. "Did they scream a lot when you cut off their arms?" Timothy asked during one such conversation, his pale blue eyes fixed intently on Dr. Harding's face. "Or were they too hurt to make noise?" The question delivered in Timothy's characteristically polite tone sent a chill through Dr. Harding that he would never forget. By November 1866, Dr. Harding had filled nearly 2 complete journals with observations about Timothy Caldwell. That of a child who possessed an adult's understanding of violence and death, combined with a complete absence of normal human empathy, was the picture that emerged. But documentation was not the same as evidence. And evidence was what Harding would need if he hoped to protect the community from what he increasingly believed was a dangerous predator. When Thomas Caldwell injured his back during the fall harvest, the opportunity to gather that evidence came. The injury required bed rest and daily medical visits, giving Dr. Harding unprecedented access to the Caldwell household. During these visits, he began engaging Timothy in longer conversations, carefully probing to understand the extent of the boy's knowledge and the nature of his thoughts. What he discovered exceeded his worst fears. For months, possibly years, Timothy Caldwell had been conducting experiments on living creatures. Using a combination of careful questioning and direct observation, Dr. Harding determined that the boy had been systematically capturing and torturing small animals, studying their responses to various forms of injury and distress. During one of their conversations, Timothy had mentioned the cave, describing it as a place where he went to think and be alone. When Dr. Harding investigated the site, he found a carefully organized collection of animal bones, crude surgical instruments fashioned from farm tools, and a series of detailed drawings that documented various experiments in torture and mutilation. The most disturbing discovery was the drawings. Rendered with surprising artistic skill for a child, they showed rabbits, squirrels, birds, and larger animals in various stages of dissection and injury. Each drawing was accompanied by notes written in Timothy's careful handwriting describing the animal's reactions, the time it took to die, and observations about which methods caused the most suffering. Subject remained conscious for approximately 10 minutes after removal of eyes, read one notation beside a detailed drawing of a rabbit. Vocalizations decreased gradually. Movement ceased after application of pressure to throat. That Timothy had been using the community's animals as subjects for increasingly sophisticated experiments in cruelty was realized by Dr. Harding. The result of Timothy's desire to test his methods on larger subjects were actually the accidental deaths on neighboring farms. But a newer set of drawings that showed human figures instead of animals was the most chilling discovery. These sketches depicted children and adults in various poses of distress and injury, each accompanied by speculative notes about human anatomy and potential methods of causing harm. One drawing showed a figure that was unmistakably Mary Fletcher, the first child to die. Another depicted Henrik Len. A third showed Jacob Mills at the bottom of a well with detailed annotations about the effects of dehydration and exposure on the human body. Not simply present when these people died had been Timothy Caldwell. He had planned their deaths, executed those plans with methodical precision, and documented the results for future study. As Dr. Harding would soon discover, the horror in Sedalia County was far from over. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next. An impossible situation was faced by Dr. Harding. The evidence in the cave proved that Timothy Caldwell was responsible for multiple deaths, but that evidence had been obtained through what amounted to a legal search. Moreover, the idea that an 8-year-old child could be a calculating murderer was so far outside the accepted understanding of human nature that no court would accept such a claim. No framework for understanding antisocial personality disorder or psychopathy was had by the medical science of 1867. The prevailing belief was that children were inherently innocent, corrupted only by bad influences or traumatic experiences. Literally inconceivable to most people was the idea that a child could be born without the capacity for empathy or moral reasoning. Dr. Harding knew that if he presented his findings to local authorities, he would likely be dismissed as a man whose mind had been damaged by too many years of treating war casualties. The evidence would be explained away. Timothy would be defended as a traumatized orphan acting out his grief, and the killings would continue. Instead, Dr. Harding decided to confront Timothy directly. During his next visit to the Caldwell farm, he asked the boy to walk with him to check on the livestock in the far pasture. Once they were alone, Dr. Harding revealed what he had discovered in the cave. Not what Dr. Harding had expected was Timothy's reaction. The boy showed no surprise, no denial, no fear at being caught. Instead, he listened calmly as Dr. Harding described the drawings and notes, occasionally nodding as if confirming the accuracy of the doctor's observations. "You're not going to tell anyone," Timothy said. When Dr. Harding finished speaking, it was not a question or a plea, but a statement of fact delivered with absolute confidence. "Why wouldn't I?" Dr. Harding asked, genuinely curious about the boy's reasoning. Smiled Timothy, the first genuine expression of emotion that Dr. Harding had ever seen on his face. "Because no one would believe you," he said. "And because you're curious about what I'll do next." On both counts, the boy was right. Dr. Harding knew that his claims would sound like the ravings of a man losing his sanity. But Timothy had also identified something that the doctor was reluctant to admit, even to himself. A scientific fascination with observing the development of what might be the most dangerous human being he had ever encountered. "How long have you been doing this?" Dr. Harding asked. "Since I was 5, Timothy replied matter-of-factly. "Maybe earlier. I started with insects, then mice, then bigger things. It's interesting to see how different animals react to the same treatments and the people who died." Shrugged Timothy. "They were experiments, too. I wanted to see if people would react the same way as animals. They do mostly, but they're better at understanding what's happening to them. That makes it more interesting." A chill that had nothing to do with the November air was felt by Dr. Harding. "What are you planning to do next?" Seriously, before answering, Timothy considered the question. "I need to find out what happens when you hurt someone who trusts you completely. Someone who wouldn't suspect anything until it was too late." Clear was the implication. Timothy was planning to kill his aunt and uncle. That he had perhaps days, possibly only hours, before Timothy acted on his plans was known by Dr. Harding. The boy had revealed his intentions with the casual confidence of someone who believed himself untouchable, and past experience suggested that Timothy did not delay once he had decided on a course of action. That evening, Dr. Harding visited Sheriff William Crawford in Sedalia. A practical man who had served with distinction in the Union Army and had little patience for theories or speculation was Crawford. But he also trusted Dr. Harding's judgment and was willing to listen to evidence regardless of how unusual the circumstances might be. Carefully, Dr. Harding presented his case, focusing on verifiable facts rather than psychological theories. He showed Crawford the drawings and notes from the cave, pointed out the pattern of deaths and accidents surrounding Timothy, and documented the boy's unusual knowledge of anatomy and violence. Most importantly, Dr. Harding revealed Timothy's stated intention to kill his aunt and uncle. This was information that could not be ignored, regardless of the source. "Even if half of what you're telling me is true," Sheriff Crawford said after reviewing the evidence, examining each disturbing drawing with growing alarm. "We can't arrest a child for drawings and suspicions, but we can watch him, and we can be ready to act if he tries anything." The anatomical precision of Timothy's sketches was studied by Crawford, noting details that even his experience as a Civil War veteran hadn't prepared him for. Hours were spent by the two men developing their strategy, bringing in Crawford's most trusted deputies, men who had served under him during the war and could be counted on to remain steady under pressure. A comprehensive plan was developed by Dr. Harding and Sheriff Crawford. At his usual time, Dr. Harding would arrive at the Caldwell farm, bringing them ostensibly for Thomas's pain management, but actually to keep both Thomas and Sarah sedated enough to prevent Timothy from harming them easily. Strategically around the farm property, Sheriff Crawford and his deputies would position themselves, close enough to respond quickly, but far enough away to avoid detection. The following morning, the plan was put into effect. As Dr. Harding approached the farmhouse in his buggy, he noticed immediately that something was different. The usual morning sounds of farm activity, chickens pecking in the yard, pigs grunting in their pen, were absent. An unsettling quiet that made his skin crawl was held by the property. In the doorway before Dr. Harding had even climbed down from his buggy, Timothy appeared. Perfectly still stood the boy, his pale blue eyes tracking the doctor's movements with predatory focus. Dressed in his usual work clothes, he was, but Dr. Harding noticed that Timothy's sleeves were rolled up past his elbows, and his hands appeared to have been scrubbed recently, the kind of thorough cleaning that suggested preparation for messy work. "Good morning, Dr. Harding," Timothy said, his voice carrying its characteristic politeness. But something underneath had changed. An anticipation was there, an excitement that the boy was struggling to contain. "I've been waiting for you." A chill through Dr. Harding was sent by the words. That he had been expecting this visit was suggested by Timothy's use of waiting. Had perhaps even been counting on it as part of whatever plan he had set in motion. Inside the house, Dr. Harding found Thomas and Sarah Caldwell in their bedroom, both apparently sleeping peacefully. But as he approached Thomas's bed to check his condition, he noticed that the man's breathing was unusually shallow, and his skin had taken on a grayish pallor that suggested more than natural sleep. "What did you give them?" Dr. Harding asked quietly, not turning to look at Timothy, but knowing the boy was watching every move he made. "Just some herbs I found in the woods," Timothy replied, his tone innocent, but his choice of words deliberate. "There are so many interesting plants growing wild around here. Some of them have very useful properties." Weak but steady was Thomas's pulse when Dr. Harding checked it. Similar symptoms were shown by Sarah. Deeply unconscious but still alive, she was. Whatever Timothy had used, he had been careful about the dosage. Helpless but alive, the boy wanted his victims, at least for now. They're not going to wake up for several hours, Timothy continued conversationally. That should give us plenty of time to talk without interruption. Unlike anything Dr. Harding had ever experienced was the conversation that followed. About murder and torture with the clinical detachment of a medical professor discussing anatomy, Timothy spoke. His experiments on animals and humans with scientific precision, he described, explaining his methodologies and the insights he had gained from each death. Mary Fletcher taught me that drowning is actually quite slow, Timothy said, settling into a chair as if beginning a pleasant afternoon chat. Everyone thinks people just slip under the water and disappear, but that's not how it works at all. There's struggling and panic and this interesting pattern of breathing attempts before the person finally gives up. I had to hold her down for almost 3 minutes before she stopped fighting. His blood turned to ice was felt by Dr. Harding. You held her under the water? Nodded Timothy eagerly. She was playing by the creek, and I told her I'd found a pretty stone on the bottom. When she bent over to look, I just pushed her head down and held it there. She was so small that it didn't take much strength, but she fought harder than I expected. That's when I realized that people have much stronger survival instincts than animals. And Henrik Larsson, that was more complicated, Timothy admitted. I couldn't overpower him physically, so I had to be more creative. I knew he checked his beehives every Thursday morning, so I went up to the bluff the night before and loosened some of the stones along the edge. Then I collected bees from one of his hives and put them in a cloth bag. As he described his methodology, Timothy's eyes gleamed. When Mr. Len climbed up to check the hives, I was waiting behind some rocks. I threw the bag of bees at his face and started shouting that there was a massive swarm attacking him. He panicked and stumbled backward right over the edge where I'd weakened the stone barrier. The fall killed him instantly, just like I calculated it would. And Jacob Mills. The tone of a teacher sharing a particularly fascinating lesson was taken on by Timothy's voice. Jacob was the most interesting of all. I didn't kill him quickly like the others. I wanted to see what would happen if someone died slowly over several days. So, I convinced him to follow me into the woods by telling him I'd found a family of baby raccoons. Paused Timothy, seeming to savor the memory. Jacob was so concerned about the imaginary baby animals that he didn't think twice about the danger. I helped him climb down into the well. Then, I moved the logs and brush to cover the opening. I visited him every day for 4 days, bringing him just enough water to keep him alive, but not enough to let him recover his strength. That Timothy was no longer speaking hypothetically about future experiments was realized by Dr. Harding. The boy had specific plans, and those plans clearly included the people currently in the house. What are you planning to do with your aunt and uncle? Directly, Dr. Harding asked. Broader than Dr. Harding had ever seen it, Timothy's genuine smile returned. That's where you come in, Dr. Harding. See, all of my previous experiments have been with people who didn't know what was happening to them until it was too late. But you're different. You understand exactly what I am and what I'm capable of. That makes you the perfect subject for a completely new type of study. As Timothy spoke, he began moving around the room, gathering items that Dr. Harding recognized as potential weapons. Rope from the barn, a heavy candlestick from the mantelpiece, several sharp kitchen implements. With methodical precision as if preparing for surgery, the boy organized his tools. I want to find out what happens when someone who knows they're going to die tries to save people they care about, Timothy continued, his excitement growing. Will you sacrifice yourself to save Uncle Thomas and Aunt Sarah? Will you try to fight me even though you know I've planned for that possibility? Will you try to run away and abandon them to save yourself? That the time for conversation had passed was known by Dr. Harding. Timothy had revealed enough of his plans to make clear that everyone in the house was in immediate mortal danger. He drew the pistol from his medical bag and pointed it at the boy. Step away from the knives, Timothy, Dr. Harding said, his voice steady despite his racing heart. At the pistol with interest rather than fear, Timothy looked. That's a Navy Colt, isn't it? He asked conversationally. I've seen pictures of them in books about the war. How many bullets does it hold? 6, Dr. Harding replied automatically, then immediately regretted providing the information. And how many people are you trying to protect? Timothy asked. There's Uncle Thomas, Aunt Sarah, yourself, and presumably the 3 law enforcement officers outside. That's 6 people, if my counting is correct. So, even if you shoot me, you'll have used up all your ammunition. Closer moved Timothy, no longer bothering to stay out of pistol range. You want to know how I became what I am? He said, his voice taking on an almost hypnotic quality. You want to understand whether I was born this way or whether something made me this way. You want to know if there are others like me and how to recognize them before they start killing. True was each statement, and as frightening as his capacity for violence was Timothy's ability to identify and exploit Dr. Harding's intellectual curiosity. Well enough to predict their behavior and manipulate their responses, even when they knew they were being manipulated, the boy understood people. As Timothy approached his sleeping uncle with a length of rope in his hands, the confrontation came. To intervene, Dr. Harding stepped forward, but Timothy moved with surprising speed and strength, producing the kitchen knife and slashing at the doctor's arm. Brief but violent was the struggle that followed. With the desperate ferocity of a cornered animal, Timothy fought, using the knife with skill that spoke of considerable practice. Smaller and weaker than Dr. Harding was the boy, but he was also faster and more agile, and he fought with the calculated precision of someone who had studied anatomy extensively. Timothy's wrist was managed to be grabbed by Dr. Harding and twisted until the boy dropped the knife, but Timothy immediately produced another blade from his clothing. That the boy had prepared multiple weapons and positioned them strategically throughout the house, it became clear. The sound of their fight brought Sheriff Crawford and his deputies running from their concealed positions. Through the back door, they burst to find Dr. Harding struggling with Timothy while Thomas and Sarah Caldwell lay unconscious on their bed, apparently unaware of the violence occurring around them. Timothy was quickly subdued by Deputy Mitchell while Dr. Harding caught his breath and checked on the unconscious couple. When the dust settled, Timothy Caldwell sat calmly in the corner of the room, his clothes torn and his face bloodied, but his pale blue eyes still holding that same cold intelligence that had first disturbed Dr. Harding so many months earlier. You can't prove anything, Timothy said as the deputy secured him with ropes. Nobody will believe that a child did all those things. At the boy with a mixture of disgust and fascination, Sheriff Crawford looked down. Maybe not, he said. But we don't have to prove everything. Attempting to murder your family is enough to see you locked up regardless of your age. At that, Timothy smiled. The same genuine expression of emotion that Dr. Harding had seen the day before. You won't hang me, he said with absolute confidence. I'm too young and I'm too interesting. Someone will want to study me instead. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in Sedalia County intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next. About his fate, Timothy Caldwell was wrong, but right about the impossibility of proving his crimes. When Sheriff Crawford attempted to present the evidence from the cave to county prosecutors, he encountered exactly the resistance that Dr. Harding had predicted. The products of a disturbed child acting out trauma from his parents' deaths were dismissed as the drawings and notes. To coincidence compounded by Timothy's unfortunate habit of being helpful during emergencies was attributed the pattern of accidents and deaths. However, the attempted murder of Thomas and Sarah Caldwell could not be explained away. 3 law enforcement officers had witnessed Timothy attacking his sleeping relatives with clear intent to kill. That an 8-year-old boy would attack family members with a knife unless something fundamental was wrong with his character could not be argued by even the most sympathetic observers. No framework for dealing with violent children was had by the legal system of 1867. For adult prosecution, Timothy was too young, but for simple placement in an orphanage or reformatory, too dangerous. Unprecedented challenges for Missouri's justice system were created by the case, attracting attention from legal scholars and medical professionals throughout the region. After weeks of legal wrangling and consultation with experts from as far away as Boston and Philadelphia, a compromise was reached. To the custody of the Missouri State Hospital for the Insane in Fulton, Timothy would be remanded, where he would be studied and treated by the most advanced alienists available in the region. No one completely was satisfied by the decision. As an adult for murder, prosecutors wanted Timothy tried, while defense attorneys argued that no child so young could be held responsible for his actions. Between those who believed Timothy could be rehabilitated and those who considered him incurably dangerous were divided medical professionals. To accompany Timothy to the hospital and remain there for 3 months, documenting the boy's behavior and working with hospital staff to develop understanding of what they were dealing with, volunteered Dr. Samuel Harding. One of the first systematic examinations of antisocial behavior in children became the resulting case study, though it would not be published until decades after the events. To hospital life with the same calculating intelligence he had shown on the farm, Timothy adapted. Appropriate emotions and responses, he quickly learned to mimic, convincing several staff members that he was making remarkable progress in overcoming his traumatic episodes. Convincingly, Timothy would cry when discussing his crimes, express remorse that seemed genuine, and display what appeared to be authentic gratitude for the care he was receiving. But merely studying the people around him, learning to manipulate them more effectively, was observed by Dr. Harding. What amounted to a comprehensive catalogue of human emotional responses had been created by the boy, and he could reproduce these signals with remarkable accuracy despite feeling none of the underlying emotions himself. Remarkable cognitive abilities coupled with complete absence of genuine emotional response are displayed by the subject, Dr. Harding wrote in his detailed reports. He has learned to simulate normal human reactions with sufficient skill to deceive casual observers. But extended observation reveals the performance to be entirely artificial. Happiness as the face people make when they want something good to continue, and sadness as the face people make when they want others to help them, are understood by Timothy. But he has never actually experienced either emotion himself. The extent of Timothy's violent fantasies and future plans was also revealed by Dr. Harding's evaluation. When the boy believed he had gained Dr. Harding's trust by pretending to be fascinated by the scientific approach to studying human behavior, Timothy began sharing ideas for future experiments that made his past crimes seem almost restrained by comparison. Elaborate scenarios for testing human responses to various forms of psychological and physical torture have been developed by him, Dr. Harding reported confidentially. Remarkable creativity and attention to detail are demonstrated by his plans, as well as a sophisticated understanding of human psychology. If he were allowed to mature and gain additional resources, he would likely become one of the most dangerous individuals in American history. That Timothy remained at the facility for 18 months, show the hospital records. During that time, several unexplained incidents occurred that bore the hallmarks of Timothy's methods. In circumstances that suggested accident or natural causes, other patients were found dead, but which showed patterns of deliberate planning when examined carefully. From apparent heart failure after interacting with Timothy died 3 elderly patients, though all had been in relatively good health previously. What appeared to be accidental falls that resulted in serious injuries were suffered by 2 younger patients. But both incidents occurred in areas where Timothy had been seen earlier in the day. Most disturbing were the reports of patients who claimed Timothy had been visiting them at night, standing silently beside their beds and watching them sleep. Unusual problems also began experiencing by hospital staff who worked closely with Timothy. Persistent nightmares after spending time with the boy were reported by several nurses, dreams that often featured detailed scenarios of violence and death. Transfers to other wards were requested by 2 attendants, claiming that they felt constantly watched, even when Timothy was supposedly confined to his room. A secret journal had been being kept by Timothy was discovered by Dr. Martha Fitzgerald, who had been brought in to provide additional expertise in treating Timothy. Paper and pencil for therapeutic writing exercises had been convinced to be provided to him by Timothy from one of the nurses, claiming that recording his thoughts and feelings would help him process his emotions more effectively. Exactly what Timothy had claimed appeared to be contained in the journal. Daily entries describing his thoughts, his regrets about past actions, and his hopes for future rehabilitation. Appropriately childlike in its language and emotional content was the writing, and it painted a picture of a deeply troubled but fundamentally redeemable young person struggling to overcome traumatic experiences. But familiarity with coded communication systems was included in Dr. Fitzgerald's training in European psychiatric techniques. When she applied analytical methods to Timothy's journal, she discovered that the innocent-seeming entries contained a sophisticated cipher system. In disturbing detail, Timothy's true thoughts and plans were revealed by the decoded messages. Rather than experiencing remorse or rehabilitation, he was conducting a systematic study of the hospital, its staff, and its security procedures. Not merely to escape was his goal, but to use his time in confinement to develop more advanced techniques for manipulation and murder. Day 47. Dr. F believes my tears during today's session were authentic, read one decoded entry. Her response pattern indicates increased sympathy and reduced suspicion. Estimate 3 more weeks of consistent performance will be required to establish sufficient trust for physical contact during sessions. To an immediate tightening of security procedures and a reduction in his contact with hospital staff led the discovery of Timothy's coded journal. But to these changes with characteristic flexibility, Timothy adapted, shifting his focus from manipulation to information gathering about hospital routines and potential escape routes. In the summer of 1868, under circumstances that were never fully explained, Timothy Caldwell disappeared from the Missouri State Hospital. That he had somehow managed to escape during a transfer between buildings despite being under constant supervision by multiple guards was concluded by the official investigation. That Timothy's escape had been far more sophisticated than the official report suggested was suspected by Dr. Harding. Remarkable patience and planning ability throughout his confinement had been demonstrated by the boy, and it seemed likely that he had spent months preparing for his departure. That he had been manipulating the facility staff far more successfully than anyone had realized was suggested by evidence discovered after Timothy's disappearance. Small policy exceptions for Timothy in the weeks before his escape were reported having been made by several guards, allowing him slightly longer exercise periods, providing him with additional reading materials, making minor adjustments to his daily routine that individually seemed harmless, but collectively may have created opportunities for escape. That facility and its personnel, he spent a year and a half studying, Dr. Harding wrote in his final report on the case. By the time he made his move, he understood the psychology of every person who worked there better than they understood themselves. His escape wasn't an act of desperation. It was the culmination of a carefully executed plan. In the months and years following Timothy's disappearance, Dr. Harding began collecting reports of suspicious deaths and accidents throughout the Midwest. Hallmarks that seemed consistent with Timothy's methods were borne by many of these incidents. Carefully staged accidents that resulted in death, evidence of systematic torture of animals, and the presence of a child who seemed unusually helpful and emotionally mature. The challenge was that Timothy would now be older, potentially strong enough to overpower adult victims, and certainly sophisticated enough to avoid the mistakes that had led to his original capture. Something unprecedented in American criminal history had been created by his time of intensive study in human psychology, combined with his natural intelligence and complete lack of moral restraint. The remaining years of his career were spent by Dr. Harding tracking these reports and attempting to develop a comprehensive understanding of what Timothy Caldwell represented. Hundreds of pages documenting cases that might have involved Timothy, along with theoretical discussions about the nature of evil and the possibility that some individuals might be born without the capacity for moral reasoning, were contained in his private journals discovered after his death in 1891. For decades after his disappearance, the broader implications of Timothy's case continued to influence discussions about criminal justice, child psychology, and mental health treatment. Uncomfortable questions about the reliability of psychiatric evaluation were raised by his ability to deceive trained professionals. While his manipulative skills highlighted the potential dangers of assuming that all children are inherently innocent and redeemable. After Thomas and Sarah recovered from their ordeal, the Caldwell farm was abandoned. Neither could bear to remain in the place where they had unknowingly harbored a killer for nearly 2 years. The property eventually reverted to the county and was sold to developers in the 1890s, but local residents avoided the area for decades afterward. By Sheriff Crawford shortly after the boy's arrest, the cave where Timothy had conducted his experiments was sealed, but the location was never forgotten by those who knew of its significance. That the cave was cursed and that animals would not graze in the surrounding area was claimed by local legend. To the Missouri Historical Society in 1923 by his daughter were donated Dr. Harding's journals, who felt that the scientific value of her father's observations outweighed concerns about the disturbing nature of the content. In the Society's archives, the journals remain available to researchers who can demonstrate legitimate academic interest in the development of psychological understanding. Publicly about their experience with Timothy, Thomas and Sarah Caldwell never spoke, but both lived under assumed names for the remainder of their lives, apparently fearing that the boy might someday return to finish what he had started. In 1889, Sarah died, and Thomas followed in 1894, neither ever had children of their own. On the broader implications of Timothy's case, reflected Dr. Harding in his final journal entry, written just days before his death in 1891. I have spent 24 years trying to understand what Timothy Caldwell represented, and I fear I have reached a disturbing conclusion. An aberration, Timothy was not. A glimpse into what human beings might become when stripped of the moral and emotional constraints that we consider fundamental to our nature, he was. If he survived to adulthood, then somewhere in America, there walks a man who understands human psychology better than any trained professional, who can manipulate people with supernatural skill, and who views the rest of humanity as nothing more than subjects for experimentation. That evil can wear the face of innocence is shown to us by this mystery, and that our assumptions about childhood and human nature may be dangerously naive. Uncomfortable questions about the nature of moral development and the possibility that some individuals may be born without the capacity for empathy or conscience that we consider fundamental to humanity are forced to be confronted by us by the case of Timothy Caldwell. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed, or might there be more to Timothy Caldwell's fate than the official records suggest? Leave your comment below and let us know your thoughts about this disturbing chapter in American history. If you enjoyed this tale and want more horror stories like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves mysteries as dark and complex as this one. Remember, the truth is often more terrifying than fiction. And history holds secrets that continue to challenge our understanding of human nature. See you in the next video.